The 16-bit era may have been the renaissance for the fighting game genre, but the brawling didn't stop there. With newer game consoles came newer and better graphics and sound and gameplay. Some of the classics were finding themselves revitalized, like the various improvements made to the Street Fighter games. Not to be left behind, Gundam threw its hat into the ring once again. Gundam Battle Assault is an interesting series to say the least. It's basically the Americanized version of the Gundam Battle Master series, but that's a little bit of a rabbit hole we don't have time to go down today. So instead, let's just not beat about the bush anymore, and let's get right into it.
Gundam Battle Assault.
Please tell me we're not going to have to listen to that the whole time. Unfortunately, that voice follows you everywhere. The narrator is just awful. Listen to how he pronounces a lot of the mobile suit names.
Z Gundam, Zack 2, Wing Gundam, Full Armor, Double Z Gundam.
Okay, I guess that technically for the Zakus you could say that Zack is a correct translation, and he could be saying Zed instead of Z because he's Canadian. But why does he say Gundam for all the other Gundams except for Wing and on the title screen, where he says Gundam? This game's irritating and we haven't even gotten to the gameplay yet. Oh yeah, and he narrates the game as it happens too.
Fire shot is empty. You're gonna die.
Shut up! So, moving past that annoyance and onto the gameplay, I suppose you could call this game another Street Fighter clone. That's what a lot of fighting games were called at the time if the control scheme was not completely original or used the typical half-circle punch method for firing projectiles. Is it a clone if it became standard though? Anyways, Gundam Battle Assault. So, the controls are pretty basic. Down forward punch lets you shoot your mobile suit's primary weapon, hitting forward down back lets you use an unblockable move, which is usually a beam saber or another melee weapon, and you use your ultimate attack by pressing down forward punch. This is fine, but sometimes you'll miss an input and just shoot your gun instead. And if you're out of ammo, it leaves you open to getting punished. There are other basic button combinations that give various moves. One thing that bugs me is the game's dodge mechanic, and I put that in quotes because it's freaking useless. By pressing two of the face buttons at once, you'll evade an enemy strike, or certain mobile suits will throw up a force field that blocks projectiles, but it drains health when you do this. What's the point of having an evade or defend feature if it hurts you? That's like jumping to the side to avoid getting hit by a car only to have someone on a bicycle crash into you. You can also press the R1 button to use your boosters. Hold the button to jump higher. Press down forward and R1 to enter boost mode, where you can fly around and gain super armor. Downside is, you can't block, and most characters can't use their mega special attack, even though some still can. Lastly, instead of having a grapple or throw mechanic like in most fighting games, pressing forward or back on the D-pad, then pressing strong punch, you will paralyze the enemy and then can punish them accordingly. Well, now that I've gotten all that out of the way, let's talk about the story for the game. For the main story mode, you play as Hero Yui, and you have a selection of mobile suits to pilot. In Versus mode, Hero is confined to the Wing Gundam, but it's really just a reskin of the Zeta Gundam. That's common practice in many fighting games, but fun fact, the Wing Gundam wasn't even in the previous Gundam Battle Master games. I only bring this up because this game is something of a mishmash of the two, mostly Battle Masters 2. Instead of the Wing, that game had the Hama Hama, a mobile suit from Double Zeta Gundam. The most likely reason for this change was that at the time, Gundam Wing was airing on Toonami, so they decided to put Wing in the game instead to promote the show. It makes sense to me. That's basically why Pokemon Yellow even existed. Just use the game to promote the TV show. Now let's do a versus match, but I can only find one controller. So I can select my mobile suit, but I can't select an enemy unless I have a second controller? Well, how about we play some story mode instead of versus then? I can't leave this menu? I'm hitting triangle, circle, and square, everything but X and start because those are the confirm buttons. I can't go back. I guess I gotta reset the console. Okay, now let's go play some story mode. The story is unimportant and nonsensical. Basically, it's somehow a continuation of Gundam Wing, and now that the war is over, Hero is going around destroying any remaining mobile suits to prevent a new era of war from starting, and he interacts with characters from the Universal Century and After Colony era. I guess Endless Waltz doesn't count in this case. There are a few different sets we have here. Specific mobile suits will let you face specific enemies, and once or twice, a unique enemy will show up in story mode so that you can beat them and unlock them. There are only 4 that are set in stone, and they are the Big Zam, Noya Zeal, Psycho Gundam Mark III, and the Hydra Gundam, the latter 2 of which are the penultimate and final bosses. Now, the Psycho Gundam just pisses me off on almost every single level. Just about everything they could get wrong, they get wrong. So, the Psycho Gundam Mark III is a Gundam that was made specifically for this game, and is actually harder than the final boss. That's all well and good, but the technicals are what piss me off. They call this one Mark III, meaning that it came after the first 2 from Zeta Gundam. Okay, but then why is it being piloted by a guy who's from the Gundam Wing timeline? And one who first appeared in a manga and not the anime? Anyways, onto the fight itself. The other 2 giant-sized enemies can't block, but also have super armor, meaning that they take full damage, but they don't react if they're being hit unless they just lost an HP tank. But no, Psycho is different. He has super armor, and he can block. Also, you can't grapple with giant units, so that means that you can't paralyze him. He hits hard and fast, and your chances to counterattack are few and far between. But that's not even the worst part of it. To unlock Hydra Gundam for PvP, you have to beat the game on hard mode without continuing, and the hardest part of it is having to kill the Psycho Gundam first. The only one I could do this with is the Yo, because his ultimate attack is unblockable. Speaking of Hydra Gundam, he's the final boss, piloted by Tres Kushronada, the main antagonist of Gundam Wing. Alright, now that I've finally got him unlocked, and I finally found a second player, let's talk about the other playable mechs in the game. Most of the playable characters are pretty comparable to each other, each one having specific strengths and weaknesses, and can be used properly with a skilled enough player. A handful do stand out though. The Big Zam and Noya Zeal are the two giant-sized units I mentioned earlier. No blocking, but they have super armor. Also, the Big Zam can't turn around, so it's wise to get behind him to avoid his massive beam cannon mega special attack. The Noya Zeal can turn around with a button input, and he's constantly flying. I already talked about Psycho, and now we come to Hydra Gundam. What makes him special is that his normal block can defend against nearly every projectile, and even unblockable moves. The last three that stand out particularly are the Ball, the New Gundam, and the classic RX-78, the original Gundam. The Ball, I'm pretty sure, is the joke character of the game, because you have to beat the story mode as every character to unlock it, but it's pathetically weak in terms of defense and has no mega special attack. But its firepower is nothing to scoff at, even if it only gets 5 shots. The RX-78 just feels like it was included for the sake of saying they have the original Gundam in the game. No ultimate attack, not a lot of creative moves or combos, just a standard beam rifle and beam saber. It does have one or two cool moves, like slamming the opponent with the shield and then firing at them in the same move. And then finally we get the New Gundam. This Gundam also doesn't have a destroyer, but it has funnels. What are funnels? Well, a select few mobile suits you can play as can use funnels, which are small flying beam cannons that you control remotely. The Sazabi, Kublai, and New Gundam each get 3, while the Quinn Mantha gets 4. The New Gundam's funnels only fire 1 shot, as opposed to the other 3 who get 2 shots, but his funnels are also indestructible, which is a reference to how in the movie Char's counterattack they could put up a defensive barrier to block enemy fire. One last character to talk about, Char Aznable's Custom Zaku. It's only unlockable with a button input. On the main screen, press left, up, right, down, square, triangle, then circle, and you should hear the confirm sound. Go to Versus mode, and now you can play as Char Zaku. This version is a lot faster than the original Zaku too, but aside from that, it's almost exactly the same. Another feature of fighting games that I like to talk about is alternate colors for the playable characters. This game has some really nice ones. The Kublai's alt skin is the Kublai Mark II from Double Zeta, and the Zeong and Sazabi actually swap palettes for their alternate colors. Also, just for fun, if you want to, you can turn both players on CPU and watch the game fight itself. Now for the stages. I'm not sure if all of these are left over from Gundam Battle Master, but I do appreciate how with some of them they tried to coordinate which mobile suit goes with which stage. For the Gundam and Zeta Gundam, they're both fought on what looks like a Gundam testing facility, and you can see a Gundam parked in the background. This could be a reference to how both Amuro and Camille got their respective Gundams by hijacking them from a testing ground. Also, the stage for the Gundam GPO-2 is a farm, with what looks like a crashed space colony in the background. And if you wanted to stretch logic here, this could be seen as an homage to how in 0083 Operation Stardust dropped a colony onto the North America grain fields. But as for what these gray mobile suits are, I have no idea. And for those curious, no, you don't get to pick the stage. The stage you play on corresponds to who the first player selected. The music is pretty good, nothing I download and listen to freely, but I'm glad they had such good music. One last complaint, you have to manually load your game every time you turn it on, instead of it auto-loading. So when you're prompted to save, you might accidentally override your progress if you're not careful. Well, it's certainly leaps and bounds better than G Gundam on the Super Famicom. This game's not bad at all, but it does have some quirks that are really hard to ignore. But that could be because I grew up playing the sequel rather than the original. You know how they say that the sequel is never as good as the original? This is the exception to that rule.
Ready? Fire! Fire! Shot down! Overheating! Your right! Shot down! Destroy it! Fire!
Nearly every single thing about Battle Assault 2 is an upgrade from the previous one. The controls, while being perfectly responsive in the first game, are made even easier to use, and now you hit down forward and then 2 buttons to use your mega special attack. A lot quicker of an input for faster paced gameplay. Other notable differences include that the thruster gauge is now 3 bars instead of 1 meter, which allows you to pull off 3 boosted jumps instead of having to hold down the R1 button. Speaking of that, if you use the dodge mechanic, you no longer take damage, but you now use 1 thruster gauge instead. Remember how some of the characters could throw up a force field last game? Now, it not only blocks almost all projectiles and uses the boosters instead of your HP, but it can now also block unblockable moves. The best music tracks from the previous game return, and we get new ones as well. And my favorite improvement from the previous game? The narrator is actually good.
Ready? Fire! Attack! Destroy it! Well, then, glory to the winner.
All combat is over. Now that you've tasted victory, I'm sure you'll be back.
It's not at all annoying this time, and though it's not quite the same voice, it actually gives me the vibe of Stalker from G Gundam, fitting since now we have G Gundam characters to play as. The entire Shuffle Alliance, plus Master Asia, and the Dark Gundam. No Shadow, Rising, or Shiny Gundams this time, but now Dark is unlockable instead of having to use cheats. The same can be said for Epion, who is back and brought the Gundams from Endless Waltz with him. Epion is piloted by Treize instead of Zex, while Zex has the Tallgeese 3, and the Hydra Gundam is rightfully piloted by Valdor, who actually has his only speaking role so far in Zex's Street Mode. So who pilots the Psycho Gundam then? Why, Ulube from G Gundam, of course. I want to be angry about this because it makes even less sense than last time, but the rest of the game is so good I can just overlook it. Almost every mobile suit from Battle Assault has returned, minus a small handful. Original Wing is nowhere to be found, but he's been replaced with Wing Zero Custom, and the rest of the Zeta suits are also gone. But the Zeta, Theo, Kubele, and Hama Hama can be reactivated using a Game Shark. So how has gameplay changed? In addition to the previously mentioned improvements, some of the returning mechs have new abilities. The Psycho Gundam can now imitate Bane by grabbing the opponent and then snapping them over its knee. The original Gundam has had the biggest improvement though. He now has a more complete moveset, adding in the Gundam Hammer and a downward stab with his beam saber, likely an homage to how Amuro destroyed the Big Zam. And if you use your unblockable move in the air, he'll attack with the Gundam Javelin. If you push back, forward, and then keep tapping the punch button, you can use a short-range head Vulcan that never runs out of bullets. And his Mega Special Attack.
Gundam Hammer!
One heck of a hammer swing that does loads of damage. They did remove one attack he had in the previous game where he'd ram you with the shield then shoot you with his rifle, but overall this is a huge net gain. One oddity that was also in the previous game is that if you deplete an enemy's HP tank with a single hit attack, the extra damage does not carry over to the next HP bar. This is just easier to demonstrate in Battle Assault 2, so I waited to point it out. Other moves worth mentioning include Death Size unblockable move being executed using forward down forward punch instead of forward down back punch, and several characters have powerful combo moves that aren't mentioned in the game's instruction manual, and the Dark Gundam has the cheapest unblockable move ever. 2 large beams that reach the entire distance of the screen. I've only successfully dodged it once or twice, and that was just because I got lucky. If you're not already jumping, or if you're in the middle of an action, just forget about it. Anything that's not an improvement over the previous one? Well, some of the changes are subjective. As far as I know, you can't make both players computer controlled, but you do have a whole separate mode for going one-on-one with the computer without needing a second controller. Some of the alternate colors are kind of lazy. This one here, only the legs are different, but most of them are great. Dragon Gundam looks amazing in blue and silver, and Heavy Arms Customs alt-color pays homage to the original red color scheme and looks fantastic. If you prefer the Zeta era suits, you're just out of luck. New Gundam still doesn't have a Mega Special Attack, and neither does the Ball. One thing that I can't decide if I like more or not is how when you use the Mega Special Attack, you no longer get the trippy blurry background, but now the game pauses for about 1 second to announce your attack.
Destroy it!
And then you do the attack. If you wanted to argue, you could say this gives the enemy more time to attempt to block, whereas the other style was more instantaneous and they had less room for countering. But one thing that I love is that when you're playing in Street Mode, the player character gets a line of dialogue and we get to see the pilot's portrait.
Seiki Haten Kyoken! Machine gun punch! Mega cannon! Too slow.
And that brings us to our next point. This game has voice acting. Not just in the cutscenes, but each character's unique moves have voiceovers too.
Gundam Javelin! Gigantic Magnum!
And for every character that's voiced, they brought back the original voice actors from the English dubbed anime. At least according to all the sources I could find. Most of them are uncredited. The story mode, now called Street Mode, lets you play a handful of different pilots and mechs. You have Domon, Chibity, and Master Asia from G Gundam, Amuro and Char from the original Gundam series, and Hero, Duo, and Zex from Endless Waltz. Most of the time, the fights are reflective of characters they encountered in their own universes. In the cutscenes, they pay homage to iconic lines from the various Gundam series.
I'm going to teach you that your mobile suit has its limits when it goes up against the Red Comet.
Once the Big Zam is mass-produced, we'll put an end to the Federation in no time.
Hey, do you know who this guy is?
School of Toho Fuhai, the winds of the king, Senshin, Keiretsu.
Ten Pacuron
Look, the east.
is burning red!
I'll kill you.
Now, how about the stages? Well, only 2 of them actually look like they were made specifically for a Gundam game. We have the Gundam Fight Arena in Neo Hong Kong and the Devil's Lair inside the Dark Gundam Colony. The rest just look kinda generic for a futuristic mecha game, but at least when they're being used in Street Mode, they sort of reflect the fights that are trying to be represented. The city background is used when fighting Master Asia and during Amuro's second fight with Char, so it could be meant to represent Shinjuku for Domon and New York for Amuro. We also have this forest base with a raising and lowering platform while unidentified ships fly overhead, and that could possibly be seen as a stand-in for the Federation's Jaburo base. And unlike the previous game, we also get 2 time attack modes, one for standard mechs, one for giant-sized units, and we also get a survival mode. These modes are used to unlock the various members of the roster. And can we just appreciate how big the roster is? Look at all these mechs. This is why I sank so many hours into this game as a kid. So many matchups, so many ways to play. This game is certainly an improvement over the Super Famicom Gundam Fighting Games, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody who played it that doesn't remember it fondly. It's a timeless classic. But we're not quite done yet. The Battle Assault legacy continues as Gundam Seed enters the fray.